What do you do when everyone assumes you don't belong? 14-year-old Jason Carter is excited for a first-class trip with his successful father, but from the moment they arrive at the airport, he faces judgment and assumptions based on how he looks. As the trip unfolds, Jason is forced to confront not just others' perceptions, but his own sense of identity and worth. Will Jason rise above the unfair treatment and discover where he truly belongs? Watch to find out, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. Let us know in the comments, how would you handle being judged unfairly? The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue across the sprawling suburbs of Boston as Jason Carter sat on his bed, staring at his packed suitcase. His room was quiet, with only the soft hum of the fan filling the air. He absent-mindedly tapped the armrest of his gaming chair, lost in thought. Today was the day his father had promised for months, a trip. Just the two of them. No work calls, no distractions. Just father and son. Jason glanced at his phone, where a message from his dad, David Carter, sat unopened. "Pick you up at 9 a.m. Be ready," the text read. It was typical of his father. Short, direct, and to the point. Despite the simplicity of the message, Jason felt a small flutter of excitement. His father had been busy for as long as Jason could remember, running one of the country's largest airline companies, which meant he was often away. The trip they were taking wasn't just any trip. It was first class to Los Angeles, a promise of a memorable getaway from their usual fast-paced lives. Jason's mind wandered to memories of the few times he and his father had really connected. Most of those moments were rare. Weekend mornings when David wasn't called into work, or the occasional soccer game when he'd managed to show up. Jason had always understood why his father wasn't around more. David was successful, respected, and carried the weight of the airline's success on his shoulders. But at 14, Jason often wondered what it would be like to have a dad who wasn't always so busy. Grabbing his backpack, Jason stood and looked at himself in the mirror. His jeans and hoodie felt comfortable enough for a long flight. His hair, still a bit messy from sleep, was quickly fixed with a few swipes of his hand. He took a deep breath, willing the nerves away. Today was supposed to be different, special even, but still he couldn't shake a strange sense of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. By 8:45 a.m., Jason was waiting in the driveway, his backpack slung over his shoulder, clutching his first-class boarding pass. His dad's black SUV rolled up the street, coming to a smooth stop in front of the house. David stepped out, looking as polished as always in his tailored suit. His phone was already pressed to his ear as he waved at Jason. "Morning, kiddo," David called out, ending his call and sliding his phone into his jacket pocket. "You ready for this?" Jason nodded, managing a smile. "Yeah, I'm ready." David clapped him on the shoulder, then tossed Jason's suitcase into the trunk. "First class all the way to LA. You're gonna love it. Plenty of legroom, gourmet meals. It'll be great." Jason climbed into the passenger seat, still trying to push away the odd feeling that something was off. As they pulled away from the curb and headed toward the airport, Jason stared out the window, watching the world pass by. His dad was talking about work, something about a meeting with investors, new expansion plans, and future business strategies. But Jason found it hard to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the idea of the trip, what it meant, and why it felt so important. This wasn't just about a vacation. It was about reconnecting, about closing the distance that had grown between them over the years. The bustling noise of the airport greeted them as soon as they stepped out of the car. David was on his phone again, making arrangements with an assistant, leaving Jason to lug his backpack toward the terminal. They breezed through check-in, thanks to his dad's VIP status, and soon found themselves standing in front of the first-class lounge. Jason had never flown first class before, but he'd heard about it from his dad, a world of luxury that most people could only dream of. But as they moved through the crowded terminal, Jason began to notice something. People were staring at him. It wasn't the typical glance or casual look that he'd grown accustomed to over the years. These were stares that lingered too long, eyes that seemed to follow him as he walked. Jason shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their gaze, tugging at the hem of his hoodie. David didn't seem to notice. He was busy talking to a colleague on the phone, his voice carrying above the din of the terminal. Jason kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, and tried to focus on navigating through the sea of travelers. As they approached the gate, David finally hung up the phone, turning to Jason with a smile. "You excited?" "First class, kid. This is the good life." Jason forced a smile. "Yeah, it'll be cool." They handed their boarding passes to the gate agent, a woman in her 40s with neatly styled hair and a sharp professional demeanor. She glanced at David's pass, scanned it, and smiled warmly. But when she looked at Jason's, her expression changed. "Sir, are you sure this is your ticket?" the woman asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she glanced up at Jason. Jason blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, that's mine." The woman hesitated, then scanned the ticket again. Her brows furrowed. "One moment, please," she said, her tone polite but distant. Jason felt a prickle of embarrassment as he stepped aside. Other passengers, many of them dressed in business suits or expensive casual wear, were watching him, their eyes flickering with curiosity. Jason fidgeted with his phone, unsure of what to do. His dad was already chatting with someone over the phone again, seemingly unaware of the awkwardness unfolding. Minutes passed, and Jason's discomfort grew. The woman behind the counter was whispering with another gate attendant, a man in his 50s with a stern face. They both glanced at Jason, and he felt the knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. What was going on? Why were they acting like this? The male gate attendant, Tom, strolled over to Jason with a smirk that made Jason's skin crawl. He looked down at Jason as though he were a curiosity, not a customer. "You sure you belong in first class, kid?" Tom's voice was laced with condescension, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Jason's casual outfit. Jason felt heat rush to his face. "Yes, I'm sure," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "My dad booked the tickets for us." Tom exchanged a glance with the woman at the counter. "Well, first class is for a particular kind of traveler," Tom continued, his tone dripping with a smug superiority. "Maybe there's been a mistake. Why don't we get you a seat in coach where you'll be more comfortable?" Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He opened his mouth to argue but found the words stuck in his throat. He felt all the eyes in the terminal on him, judging him, assuming he didn't belong. His phone buzzed in his pocket and Jason quickly pulled it out, hoping it was his father. He texted a quick message. "They won't let me in first class. Something's wrong." The seconds felt like hours as he waited for a reply, his stomach twisting in knots. When his phone finally buzzed again, Jason glanced down at the screen, relief washing over him as he read his father's response. "Stay there. Don't move. I'll handle it." But Jason didn't feel completely reassured. His father's words, though meant to calm him, felt distant. He wasn't sure how his dad would handle it or if he even understood what Jason was going through. Tom was still standing in front of him, waiting for Jason to back down. Jason's grip tightened around his phone, his frustration simmering just below the surface. He wanted to scream, to demand they treat him with the same respect they gave the other passengers. But his throat felt tight, and his voice refused to cooperate. Just when Jason thought the situation couldn't get worse, the phone behind the counter rang. Melissa, the female gate attendant, picked it up, her expression stiff and professional. "Gate 4, she said, her voice clipped. As she listened, her face slowly drained of color. Her eyes darted to Jason, and her hand trembled slightly as she set the phone back down. I understand, sir," she stammered, glancing at Tom with wide eyes. "Yes, right away." Melissa turned to Tom, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the boss's son," she said, her words rushed and frantic. "His father owns the airline." The color drained from Tom's face. He blinked, his earlier arrogance crumbling in an instant. He looked back at Jason, his expression filled with shock and regret. Tom's entire demeanor changed in the blink of an eye. The smug superiority disappeared, replaced by a forced smile. "Terribly sorry about that, young man," he said, his voice sickly sweet now. "There's been a misunderstanding. We'll get you seated in first class right away." Jason's head was spinning. Just moments ago, they had treated him like an outsider, someone who didn't belong. And now, because of who his father was, they were bending over backward to accommodate him. It didn't feel right. None of them felt right. He followed Tom silently as he was escorted to the first-class cabin, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and humiliation. The plush leather seat felt cold against his skin as he sat down, the flight attendants hurrying around him with forced smiles and overly polite offers of drinks and snacks. But Jason wasn't hungry. He wasn't thirsty. He was angry. Angry that they hadn't seen him for who he was, just a kid trying to travel with his father. Instead, they judged him, dismissed him, until they realized who his father was. Jason stared out the window as the plane began to taxi down the runway, the city shrinking into a patchwork of lights and roads below. His phone buzzed in his hand, another message from his father. "Are you okay?" Jason stared at the words, unsure of how to respond. He typed a simple reply, "Yes," but he knew deep down it wasn't the truth. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane soared through the sky, but for Jason, the sound was distant, almost muted. He stared out of the window, watching the clouds pass by below. The city was long gone, replaced by an endless stretch of blue sky, but his thoughts were still trapped back at the gate. The way Melissa and Tom had treated him before realizing who his father was kept replaying in his mind. Jason shifted in his seat, the luxurious leather feeling too stiff, too cold, as if it didn't belong to him. The flight attendants were moving up and down the aisle, offering first-class passengers a variety of drinks and gourmet snacks. Their smiles were bright, but Jason couldn't help noticing how they glanced at him when they thought he wasn't looking. The judgment, the assumptions all lingered in their eyes, even behind those polished smiles. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" a flight attendant asked, her tone cheerful but forced, like she was compensating for the earlier awkwardness. Jason looked up, offering a small, uncomfortable smile. Just water, thanks." As she handed him the water, Jason caught a glimpse of the other passengers around him. Most of them were older, dressed in expensive suits or casual clothes that screamed designer brands. They all seemed perfectly at ease, chatting quietly or reading newspapers. They belonged here, Jason realized. Not just because they had first-class tickets, but because they carried themselves like they were used to this, like the world had always treated them this way. Jason shifted again, feeling the weight of the experience settle heavily in his chest. He'd flown many times before, but never first class. And now, despite sitting in one of the most luxurious seats on the plane, he felt more out of place than ever. His clothes, just jeans and a hoodie, felt wrong, like they didn't match the image of the other passengers. He couldn't help but wonder if that was why they had judged him in the first place. Did clothes make the man? Or did something deeper define whether someone was worthy of respect? Jason's phone buzzed softly in his hand. He glanced down to see another text from his father. "We'll talk when we land. I'll meet you at the gate." Jason stared at the message for a long time, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't sure if his father would truly understand what had happened, if he even could. His father had lived his whole life in a world where people respected him because of his success, his power, and his wealth. But Jason wasn't sure that world was his to claim. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Jason leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind was too busy, too loud with the conflicting emotions tearing through him. On the one hand, he knew the flight was supposed to be a fun, bonding experience, a special treat his father had promised for so long. On the other hand, that moment at the gate had soured everything. It wasn't just that they had judged him. It was the way everything changed the moment they realized his father was powerful. It was as though their perception of him had flipped, not because of anything he'd done, but because of who his father was. And that thought, it gnawed at him. Jason's father always talked about earning respect, about working hard to be successful. But in that moment at the gate, Jason had done nothing but exist. He hadn't earned anything. They hadn't even bothered to give him the chance. It felt like everything had been reduced to wealth and status, like the value of a person wasn't in their character, but in the amount of power they could wield. A part of him wanted to tell his father how it had felt, how much it hurt to be looked down on like that. But another part of him wasn't sure if his dad would understand. His father had spent his entire life in a world where doors opened for him simply because of his name. Could someone like that truly understand what it felt like to be judged before you even had the chance to prove yourself? Jason's stomach twisted with frustration. He opened his eyes and reached for his phone, scrolling through his messages. A few of his friends had texted him, asking what the first-class experience was like, and he debated telling them the truth. Instead, he typed out a vague response. "It's fine. Pretty fancy, I guess." He hit send, not wanting to get into the details of what had really happened. As he put his phone away, he realized that this trip, which was supposed to be special, was turning into something else entirely. It wasn't just about flying first class or spending time with his dad anymore. It was about something deeper, about how people saw him and about how he saw himself in a world that seemed to judge based on appearances and assumptions. The plane touched down smoothly in Los Angeles, and Jason felt a knot of tension release from his chest. The familiar feeling of landing after a long flight was usually a relief, but today it felt different. The weight of what had happened back at the gate was still there, heavy in his mind. As the plane taxied to the gate, Jason gathered his things slowly, waiting for the first-class cabin to clear out. The other passengers were already on their feet, grabbing their designer luggage from the overhead bins and chatting casually about their plans in LA. Jason stayed seated, feeling the pressure to hurry, but also wanting to avoid the stares that he knew were coming. When the aisle finally cleared, Jason stood up and slung his backpack over his shoulder. He stepped off the plane, walking down the jet bridge with a mix of relief and anxiety. He had no idea what he was going to say to his father. Maybe it wasn't worth bringing up. Maybe it was better to just let it go and enjoy the trip. But as soon as he saw his father waiting at the gate, looking down at his phone, the frustration bubbled up again. David looked up and smiled when he saw Jason, waving him over. "There you are. How was the flight?" Jason shrugged. "It was fine." David's smile faded slightly, sensing something off. "What happened? You don't seem like yourself." Jason hesitated, his mind racing. Should he tell him? Would it even make a difference? "They didn't want to let me in first class," Jason finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "They didn't think I belonged until they found out who you were." David frowned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Jason shifted uncomfortably, his hands tightening on the straps of his backpack. "The gate attendants, they thought I had the wrong ticket. They didn't want to let me on the plane until they realized you own the airline." David's face tightened, his jaw clenching. "I'm sorry, Jason. I didn't expect that to happen. I thought things would be different." Jason shook his head. "It's not your fault. It's just, I don't know. It's the way people are, I guess." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the busy terminal fading into the background. Jason looked at his father, searching for something, some acknowledgement of what he had felt. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll talk to them. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Jason nodded, but the words didn't bring him the comfort he'd hoped for. His dad meant well, but he still didn't get it. It wasn't just about fixing the situation or making sure it didn't happen again. It was about how it felt in that moment. Like no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, there would always be people who saw him less. Later that evening, after they'd settled into their hotel, Jason and his father sat in the lounge, waiting for room service. The tension from earlier had faded slightly, but it still lingered in the air between them. David glanced over at Jason, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know," he said quietly, "when I was starting out, people didn't take me seriously either." Jason looked up, surprised. His father rarely talked about his early days, about what it was like before he became a successful CEO. Jason had always assumed his dad's rise to the top had been smooth, almost inevitable. David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Back when I was first getting into the airline business, I was young, and I didn't have a lot of connections. People looked at me like I didn't belong, like I was just some kid with big ideas and no way to back them up." Jason frowned, trying to imagine his father as anything other than the confident, successful man he'd always known. "Really?" David nodded. "Yeah. It took a long time for people to take me seriously. I had to prove myself over and over again. And even then, there were still people who judged me based on things that had nothing to do with who I was or what I could do." Jason leaned back in his chair, processing his father's words. It wasn't exactly the same as what he had gone through, but it helped, knowing that his dad had faced his own struggles, his own moments of doubt. "But you made it," Jason said quietly. "You proved them wrong. David smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. Yeah, I did. But it wasn't easy. And I know it's not easy for you either. People are always going to make assumptions, Jason. They're always going to judge you before they know you. But that doesn't mean you have to let them define you. Jason nodded, his father's words sinking in. Maybe it wasn't about avoiding the judgment or trying to change people's minds. Maybe it was about knowing who you were, no matter what anyone else thought. The room service arrived, interrupting the conversation, and they spent the rest of the evening eating and talking about lighter things, places they wanted to visit in LA, the food they were excited to try. The tension from earlier wasn't completely gone, but it felt lighter now, less oppressive. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he and his father were truly connecting. The next morning, Jason and his father planned to spend the day exploring Los Angeles, checking out the beaches, grabbing lunch at a popular restaurant, and maybe even taking a tour of the city. Jason was still processing their conversation from the night before, but for the first time in a while, he felt a small sense of calm. Maybe this trip really would be the start of something new for him and his father. They stepped out of the hotel elevator, heading toward the front lobby to meet their driver. The lobby was busy, filled with tourists and business travelers, and Jason caught a few glances from people who seemed to size him up the moment they saw him. He had grown accustomed to it by now, the way people looked at him like they were trying to figure out if he fit in. The unease was still there, but Jason tried to push it aside. As they reached the front desk to check on their ride, a bellboy approached them, his expression shifting as he glanced at Jason. "Excuse me," the bellboy said, his tone polite but distant. "Are you lost? The hotel staff entrance is through the side door." Jason froze, the words hanging in the air. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. The hotel staff entrance? His mind raced, confusion quickly giving way to frustration. Did this guy just assume he didn't belong here because of the way he looked? Because he was dressed casually? The familiar knot of anger started to tighten in his chest again. David, who had been talking to the concierge, turned around just in time to see the exchange. His face tightened, and he stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "No, we're guests here," David said, his eyes narrowing at the bellboy. "We're not lost." The bellboy's eyes widened in realization, and his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean—" David cut him off. "I'm sure you didn't." His voice was low, but Jason could hear the frustration simmering underneath. He turned back to Jason, his expression softening. "Come on, let's go." They walked away from the bellboy without another word, but Jason's mind was spinning. It was happening again. Another person making assumptions about him without knowing anything about him. Jason clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the anger simmering just below the surface. As they stepped outside into the warm California air, Jason couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why does this keep happening?" he burst out, his voice tight with frustration. "Why do people keep treating me like I don't belong?" David stopped walking, turning to face Jason. He looked at his son, his expression unreadable for a moment, then sighed. "People make assumptions, Jason," he said quietly. "It's not right, but it happens." "But why?" Jason asked, his voice cracking with anger. "Why do they look at me and think I'm not supposed to be here? I didn't do anything wrong." David ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with how to respond. "I wish I had an easy answer for you," he said after a moment. "I wish I could tell you it'll get better. But the truth is, some people they judge others based on things that have nothing to do with who they really are." Jason bit his lip, trying to hold back the tears of frustration that threatened to spill over. "It's not fair," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "No, it's not," David agreed, his voice soft. "But that doesn't mean you let them win. You keep being yourself no matter what they think. You belong wherever you choose to be, Jason. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Jason looked up at his father, his heart heavy with the weight of his emotions. He wanted to believe his father's words, wanted to feel like he truly belonged. But right now, all he could feel was the sting of being judged over and over again, no matter where he went or what he did. They stood there in silence for a moment, the noise of the city bustling around them. Jason took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He didn't know how to make the anger go away. But maybe, just maybe, His father was right. Maybe the only thing he could control was how he reacted, how he refused to let other people's assumptions define him. That evening, after a long day of sightseeing, Jason and his father returned to the hotel. Jason was still feeling the weight of the morning's encounter, but he tried to push it aside, focusing instead on enjoying the time with his dad. They had dinner at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city, and for a little while, Jason managed to forget about the frustrations of the day. But when they returned to their room, Jason's father had another call to take, another work emergency that couldn't wait. Jason didn't mind. He was used to it now. But just as he was about to settle in for the night, there was a knock at the door. Jason opened it to find his Aunt Linda standing there, her face lighting up with a warm smile. "Hey, kiddo," she said, pulling him into a quick hug. "Your dad told me you guys were in town, so I thought I'd stop by and say hi." Aunt Linda was David's older sister, and she lived nearby in LA. Jason had always liked her. She was the kind of person who could make anyone feel at ease, and she always seemed to know when something was bothering him. "Come on in," Jason said, stepping aside to let her in. "Dad's on a call, but he should be done soon." Linda nodded, glancing around the room before turning back to Jason. "So, how's the trip going? You guys having a good time?" Jason shrugged, not sure how to answer. "It's been okay," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral. Linda raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing that something was off. She sat down on the edge of the bed, patting the spot next to her. "Come on, kiddo. What's going on? You know you can talk to me." Jason hesitated for a moment, then sat down next to her. The frustration and anger he'd been holding in all day started to bubble to the surface again. "It's just, everywhere we go, people keep looking at me like I don't belong," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "At the airport, at the hotel, even just walking around, they keep judging me, like they're waiting for me to mess up or something." Linda listened quietly, her expression softening as Jason spoke. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry you're going through that, Jason," she said gently. "It's not fair, and it's not right. But you know what? It's their problem, not yours." Jason looked down at the floor, his chest heavy with the weight of his emotions. "But it still feels like it's my problem," he muttered. "It's like no matter what I do, people are always going to see me the wrong way." Linda squeezed his shoulder. "I know it feels that way sometimes," she said, "and I'm not going to lie to you. There will always be people who make assumptions, who judge you before they even know you. But that doesn't mean you have to accept their judgment. You are so much more than what other people think of you, Jason." Jason glanced up at her, his frustration still simmering but beginning to cool. "But how do I make it stop? How do I make them see me for who I really am?" "You can't always control how other people see you," Linda said softly, "but you can control how you see yourself. Don't let their judgment make you doubt your own worth. You belong here just as much as anyone else. And the people who really matter, they'll see you for who you are." Jason nodded, her words sinking in. He knew she was right, but it was still hard to accept. It was hard to let go of the anger he felt every time someone judged him without knowing him. But maybe, just maybe, he could start by focusing on how he saw himself, on not letting their assumptions define him. Linda smiled at him, her eyes warm with understanding. "You're a strong kid, Jason. Don't forget that." Jason managed a small smile in return. "Thanks, Aunt Linda." The following day, Jason and his father were invited to a formal event hosted by one of David's business associates. It was a fancy affair, held in a large ballroom at an upscale hotel, and Jason felt out of place the moment they walked through the doors. The men wore expensive suits, the women donned designer dresses, and the air was filled with the quiet hum of polite conversation. Jason tugged at the collar of his button-down shirt, feeling uncomfortable in the formal clothes his dad had insisted he wear. He stuck close to his father, trying to blend in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching him, judging him. His earlier conversation with Aunt Linda had helped, but the nagging sense of not belonging was still there, lurking beneath the surface. As they mingled with the other guests, Jason overheard snippets of conversations, talk of investments, luxury vacations, and high-end real estate. He felt more out of place with every passing minute. At one point, as Jason stood by the refreshment table, a man in his 50s approached. He was dressed in an immaculate suit, his hair slicked back with precision. He glanced at Jason, his eyes sweeping over him with a subtle, dismissive judgment. "You must be David's son," the man said, his voice polite but cold. "I didn't realize he had a kid so young." Jason nodded, feeling the man's gaze linger on him like an unwanted spotlight. "Yeah, I'm Jason." The man's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I see. Well, enjoy the party," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But be careful. This isn't really a place for kids. You might find yourself out of your depth." Jason's stomach tightened, the knot of anger from the past few days returning in full force. He clenched his fists at his sides, biting back the urge to snap at the man. But before he could say anything, his father appeared at his side. David's expression was calm, but Jason could see the tension in his posture. "Is there a problem here?" David asked, his voice quiet but firm. The man smiled again, this time more genuinely. "No problem at all," he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Just offering some advice." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he placed a hand on Jason's shoulder and steered him away from the man, toward a quieter corner of the room. "Ignore him," David muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't know what he's talking about." But Jason couldn't ignore it. The man's words echoed in his head, feeding into all the doubts and frustrations he'd been feeling for the past few days. He felt like he was drowning in it, this constant pressure to prove himself, to belong in a world that seemed determined to keep him out. Jason stopped walking, turning to face his father. "Why do people keep treating me like I don't belong?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be judged everywhere I go." David looked at his son, his expression softening with sympathy. "I know, Jason," he said quietly, "and I wish I could make it stop. But the world, it's not always fair." Jason shook his head, his chest tight with frustration. "It's not fair at all." David sighed, placing a hand on Jason's shoulder. "You don't have to prove anything to them, Jason. You belong here, just as much as anyone else. Don't let them make you feel otherwise." Jason nodded, his father's words sinking in. But even as he tried to let the anger go, he couldn't help but feel the weight of it still pressing down on him. It was exhausting, constantly fighting to be seen for who he really was, instead of what people assumed about him. As the evening wore on, Jason and his father stayed at the event, mingling with the other guests and trying to enjoy themselves. But the encounter with the man at the refreshment table lingered in Jason's mind, a constant reminder of the struggle he faced. David could see it too. He watched his son throughout the night, noticing the way Jason's shoulders tensed whenever someone glanced his way, the way he hesitated to speak when introduced to new people. David had always prided himself on being able to handle difficult situations, to navigate the complexities of his business with ease. But this was different. This was his son, his quiet, thoughtful son, who was clearly hurting. It wasn't until they were on their way back to the hotel that David finally spoke up. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," he began, his voice soft in the quiet of the car, "about how people keep judging you. I've been so focused on my own work, on my own life, that I didn't realize how hard this has been for you." Jason glanced over at his father, surprised by the admission. David rarely talked about feelings, especially not his own. "I've always believed that if you worked hard enough, if you proved yourself, people would respect you," David continued. "But I see now that it's not always that simple. People can be unfair, and sometimes, no matter what you do, they'll still judge you based on things that have nothing to do with who you are." Jason nodded, his father's words hitting close to home. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that's what it feels like." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry, Jason. I didn't realize how much this was affecting you. I thought if I could just give you everything I never had, you'd have an easier time. But I see now that it's not about money or power. It's about something deeper." Jason was quiet for a moment, his father's words sinking in. He had always admired his dad, respected him for everything he had accomplished, but hearing him admit that he didn't have all the answers, that he was still figuring things out, made Jason feel closer to him than he had in a long time. "I don't need everything handed to me," Jason said quietly. "I just want to be treated like I belong." David nodded, his expression serious. "And you do belong, Jason. I know it's hard, but you have to keep believing that. No one can take that away from you." For the first time in days, Jason felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe his father didn't have all the answers, but he was trying, and that was enough for now. The following morning, the sun shone brightly over the Los Angeles skyline as Jason sat on the balcony of their hotel room, staring out at the city below. It was still early, and the streets were just beginning to come alive with the hustle and bustle of a new day. The tension of the previous night had lessened, but Jason still felt its weight lingering in his chest. His conversation with his father had helped, but it hadn't erased the frustration that had been building inside him over the past few days. He kept thinking about that man at the event, how casually he'd dismissed Jason, as though he didn't belong. And no matter how many times his father told him that he did belong, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that there would always be people who saw him as less. People who judged him based on his appearance, his age, or some other superficial factor. But as he sat there, listening to the sounds of the city, Jason thought about what his Aunt Linda had said. He couldn't control how other people saw him. He couldn't change their assumptions or make them see him for who he really was. But he could control how he saw himself. He could refuse to let their judgment define him. Jason pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages from his friends back home. They were all excited to hear about his trip, asking him what first class was like, what Los Angeles was like. For a moment, Jason considered telling them everything: the awkward stares, the assumptions, the way people had treated him as though he didn't belong. But then he realized something. The trip wasn't just about those moments of discomfort. There had been good moments too. Moments where he had bonded with his father, where they had finally connected after so much distance. And maybe that was what he needed to focus on. Maybe that was where his strength came from, not from proving himself to strangers, but from knowing that the people who mattered saw him for who he really was. Jason typed a quick message to his friends. "It's been a good trip. LA is amazing, and the first class was crazy fancy. But the best part has been spending time with my dad." He hit send, feeling a small sense of relief. For the first time in a while, he felt like he was starting to take control of the narrative, starting to shape the story of his life, instead of letting other people's assumptions shape it for him. Later that afternoon, Jason and his father headed to another event. This one was a business lunch at a high-end restaurant downtown. David had been invited by another business associate, and though Jason wasn't particularly excited about spending another day surrounded by wealthy strangers, he agreed to go, hoping that this time would be different. The restaurant was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city. Jason and his father were seated at a long table with several other guests, all of them dressed in expensive suits and dresses. Jason felt the familiar knot of unease in his stomach as he looked around, but he reminded himself of what his father and Aunt Linda had said. He belonged here, whether other people believed it or not. As the meal progressed, Jason tried to relax, focusing on the food and the conversation around him. But as the guests began to chat more freely, the topic of conversation shifted to wealth and status. One of the men at the table, a tall, silver-haired businessman named Richard, leaned back in his chair and smirked as he sipped his wine. "You know," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension, "it's funny how people think they can just walk into these places and act like they belong, just because they can afford a ticket or a reservation. There's more to it than that, you know? It's about class, about knowing how to carry yourself." Jason stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he listened to Richard's words. He wasn't addressing Jason directly, but the insinuation was clear. Richard glanced around the table, his gaze lingering on Jason for just a moment too long. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, the familiar anger rising inside him. He had heard enough of these subtle digs, these veiled insults that questioned his right to be in these spaces. But this time, he wasn't going to stay quiet. This time, he was going to stand up for himself. "Maybe it's not about class," Jason said, his voice steady but firm. "Maybe it's about how you treat people. You know, like judging someone before you even know them. The table fell silent, all eyes turning to Jason. Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that Jason had spoken up. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've got a lot to learn, kid," he said, his tone dismissive. "This world isn't for everyone." Jason's hands clenched into fists under the table, but he didn't back down. "Maybe you're the one who has a lot to learn," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Because the world isn't just for people like you. It's for everyone." Richard's smirk faded, and for a moment, Jason thought he might argue. But before he could say anything else, David spoke up, his voice calm but authoritative. "Jason's right," David said, glancing at Richard with a stern expression. "It's not about class or money, it's about how you treat people. And if you don't understand that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." Jason felt a surge of pride as his father stood up for him, backing him up in front of the entire table. Richard's face turned red, and he muttered something under his breath, but he didn't argue any further. The tension at the table slowly dissolved, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. As the lunch continued, Jason felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in a long time. He had stood up for himself. For the first time, he hadn't let someone else's judgment define him. And his father had supported him, reinforcing the lesson that had taken Jason so long to learn. He belonged, not because of his father's success or his first-class ticket, but because he was Jason. Nothing more, nothing less. After the lunch ended, Jason and his father walked back to the car in silence. The weight of what had happened at the table still hung in the air, but this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something had shifted, something important. As they drove back to the hotel, David glanced over at Jason, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm proud of you, you know," he said quietly. Jason looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For standing up for yourself," David said, his voice warm. "I've been watching you these past few days, and I know it hasn't been easy. But today, you didn't let him get to you. You didn't let his judgment define you." Jason smiled, feeling a sense of pride well up inside him. I didn't want to keep quiet anymore," he admitted. "I was tired of letting people think they could treat me like I don't belong." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've spent my whole life fighting to belong in this world, Jason. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I built a name for myself, people would respect me. But now I see that it's not just about proving yourself to other people. It's about knowing that you belong, even when they don't see it." Jason was quiet for a moment, letting his father's words sink in. He had always admired his dad's success, but now he saw that his father's journey had been more difficult than he realized. David had fought his own battles, faced his own doubts and judgments, and now Jason was beginning to understand that their struggles, while different, were connected. "You've taught me a lot, Dad," Jason said quietly, "but I think the most important thing you've taught me is that I don't have to prove anything to anyone. I just have to be myself." David smiled, reaching over to ruffle Jason's hair. "You're a smart kid," he said affectionately. "Smarter than I was at your age, that's for sure." Jason laughed, feeling a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in days. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with who he was. He didn't have to keep fighting for other people's approval because he knew deep down that he belonged, no matter where he was or what anyone else thought. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Jason and his father stood on the balcony of their hotel room, watching the lights of Los Angeles twinkle below. The air was cool and refreshing, and Jason felt a sense of calm settling over him. His father had been quiet for most of the evening, but now as they stood together, David finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what we've been through on this trip," he said softly, "about the way people have treated you. And I realize now that I haven't always been there for you the way I should have been." Jason looked up at his father, surprised by the admission. "What do you mean?" David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've spent so much time focused on my work, on building my business, that I didn't see how hard it's been for you. I thought if I gave you everything you needed, money, security, opportunities, that it would be enough. But I see now that it's not just about that. It's about being there for you, emotionally. It's about helping you navigate this world that's not always kind." Jason felt a lump form in his throat, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "You've done your best, Dad," he said quietly, "and I appreciate everything you've done for me. But yeah, it's been hard sometimes." David nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I want to do better, Jason. I want to be there for you more. I know I can't protect you from everything, but I can at least be someone you can talk to, someone who understands." Jason smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." They stood in silence for a while, watching the city below. Jason's mind was calm, his thoughts no longer racing with frustration or anger. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he understood himself and his father a little better. As the night deepened, Jason realized something important. The world wasn't always fair, and there would always be people who judged him, who saw him as something less. But he didn't have to accept their judgment. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone but himself. He belonged not because of his father's success, not because of the first-class ticket, but because he was Jason. And that, he knew, was enough. 2 weeks had passed since the trip to Los Angeles, and Jason was back home in Boston, sitting at the breakfast table with his dad. The familiar sounds of their house, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator, felt comforting after the whirlwind of emotions and experiences they had gone through in California. Jason had been reflecting on everything that had happened, the encounters with people who judged him, the emotional moments he'd shared with his father, and, most importantly, the lessons he had learned about himself. As he sat there sipping his orange juice, he realized that something had changed inside him. The knot of frustration and insecurity that had weighed him down for so long was finally beginning to loosen. He felt lighter, more grounded in who he was. The trip hadn't been easy, but it had shown him something important, that he could navigate the world on his own terms, without letting other people's judgments define him. David, who was reading the morning newspaper, glanced up at Jason. "You've been quiet since we got back," he said, folding the paper and setting it aside. "How are you feeling?" Jason thought about the question for a moment before answering. "I'm good," he said honestly. "Better than I was before." David raised an eyebrow, his expression curious. "Yeah? How so?" Jason set down his glass and leaned back in his chair. "I don't know. I just feel like I'm not as worried about what other people think anymore. I mean, it still bothers me when people judge me, but it doesn't feel as heavy. I know who I am now, and I know I belong, no matter what they think." David smiled, a look of pride flashing in his eyes. "That's a big realization," he said. "It takes some people their whole lives to figure that out." Jason shrugged, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. "I guess I just got tired of letting other people decide how I should feel about myself." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly right. You've got to live your life for yourself, not for anyone else." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning light streaming in through the kitchen window. Jason felt a deep sense of peace, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't that the world had changed, it was that he had changed, and that made all the difference. "So," David said after a moment, his tone lightening, "are you ready for school tomorrow?" Jason grinned, rolling his eyes. "Not even close. Summer went by way too fast." David chuckled, shaking his head. "That's how it always feels. But hey, at least you've got some good stories to tell your friends about the trip." Jason's smile faltered slightly as he thought back to the moments of discrimination and judgment he'd faced during the trip. He wasn't sure if he wanted to relive those experiences by talking about them with his friends. But then again, maybe sharing what he'd learned would help them understand him better. "I might tell them some of it," Jason said thoughtfully, "but I think I'll focus on the good parts, like the time we spent together." David looked at him, a warmth in his eyes that Jason hadn't seen often before. "I'm glad to hear that," he said quietly, "because that was the best part for me too." The next day, Jason stood in front of his high school, watching as students hurried inside to start the new school year. The familiar buzz of chatter and laughter filled the air, and Jason felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. It was always strange coming back after summer break, but this time, things felt different. He had changed. The way he saw the world and the way he saw himself wasn't the same as it had been before the trip to Los Angeles. And as he looked around at his classmates, he realized that he was seeing them differently too. Jason made his way through the hallways, weaving through the crowds of students as he headed to his locker. He passed by a few kids he recognized last year, some of whom had been part of the popular crowd. The ones who always seemed so sure of themselves, so confident in their place at school. Jason had spent a lot of time wondering if he'd ever feel as comfortable in his own skin as they seemed to be in theirs. But now he realized that it didn't matter. He didn't need to compare himself to them anymore. He didn't need their approval because he had already found his own sense of belonging. He was Jason Carter, and that was enough. At his locker, Jason was greeted by a couple of his friends, Logan and Emma, who were chatting excitedly about their summers. When they saw Jason, they waved him over. "Dude, how was LA?" Logan asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Did you get to meet any celebrities?" Jason laughed, shaking his head. "No celebrities, but it was still pretty cool. I got to fly first class for the first time." Emma raised an eyebrow, impressed. "First class? Fancy. How was that?" Jason hesitated for a moment, the memories of the trip flashing through his mind. He thought about the uncomfortable stares, the assumptions people had made about him. But then he remembered the conversations he'd had with his dad, the lessons he had learned about standing up for himself and finding his own sense of worth. "It was interesting," Jason said, choosing his words carefully. "There were some moments that were kind of tough, but I learned a lot about myself." Logan and Emma exchanged confused glances. "Tough? What do you mean?" Logan asked. Jason thought for a moment, then decided to be honest. "There were a few times when people didn't think I belonged in first class. They made assumptions about me because of how I looked, or because I didn't seem like I fit in with the other passengers. It wasn't easy to deal with, but in the end I realized that it doesn't really matter what they think. What matters is how I see myself." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good lesson to learn. People can be so judgmental, especially when they don't know the whole story." Jason smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It felt good to talk about it, to share his experience with his friends without letting it weigh him down. He had faced those challenges, and he had come out stronger because of them. As they walked to their first class of the day, Jason felt a new sense of confidence. He wasn't worried about fitting in or being judged anymore. He knew who he was, and that was enough. When they reached the classroom, Jason took a seat at his desk, pulling out his notebook and pens. The teacher began to call roll, and Jason glanced out the window, watching as the sunlight streamed in through the glass. For the first time in a long time, he felt completely at ease. Jason's journey of self-discovery had been challenging, but it had also been transformative. He had faced moments of judgment, moments where people had tried to make him feel like he didn't belong. But through those experiences, he had learned that his worth wasn't defined by other people's opinions. It was defined by him. The trip to Los Angeles had been a turning point in Jason's life. It had shown him that the world wasn't always fair, and that there would always be people who made assumptions based on appearances or status. But it had also shown him that he had the power to rise above those judgments, to stand tall and be proud of who he was, no matter what anyone else thought. As he sat in his classroom, ready to face the challenges of a new school year, Jason knew that there would still be difficult moments ahead. There would still be people who judged him unfairly, but now he was ready for it. He was stronger, more confident, and more sure of himself than ever before. The world might not have changed, but Jason had, and that, he realized, was enough. If you enjoyed Jason's journey of self-discovery and the lessons he learned about belonging, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We've got more powerful stories coming your way, exploring themes of identity, resilience, and overcoming life's challenges. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on our next story, and share this video with friends who might need a reminder that their worth comes from within. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more inspiring content.